Good afternoon and welcome to Tuesday Topics. In accordance with the fire marshal who is in the room, I would just like to point out that we have emergency exits, one here and two in the back, and where you are sitting may not be the closest exit to you, so please be aware in case of emergency. How'd I do, Ted? Okay? All right, great. I'm Rebecca Foose. I'm with the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library, and pleased that you're all here today. Thank you for supporting the Friends and Foundation with your past and future support, and also for attending our Tuesday Topics series. We've had a great run of 8 topics, and this concludes the series for 2016. We take 1 week break for our huge used book sale. So in this very room, we will have thousands of used books. I encourage you to come and shop and pick out some great bargains. And then we will begin our Book Sandwiched in 2 weeks, and this will begin our 60th year of book reviews. So we have a great spring lineup as well, and we're looking forward to that. So today, gun violence and gun control. Where do we go from here? As with all of our programs, we ask that you listen respectfully to our guests' presentations and then wait for them to call on you during the question and answer time. Please keep it brief and in the form of a question in order that we can cover as much as we can. And remember, this is not a discussion about sides, but about the facts of gun violence and common ground for solutions as a public health issue. Our presenters today are Peter Reed and Gary Pudup. Peter grew up in Macedon. He's a retired Air Force officer and government consultant whose 19-year-old daughter, Mary Karen Reed, was killed during the 2007 Virginia Tech massacre, the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. Since her death, Reed has become a renowned advocate for changes to both federal and state public policy and legislation regarding gun control, and was appointed a charter member of the Virginia Tech Family Outreach Foundation by Virginia Governor Tim Kaine. Gary is from Rochester and graduated from RIT with a degree in criminal justice. After 30 years of police service, he retired as a command officer with the Monroe County Sheriff's Office. Some of his police service included training first responders in active shooter situations. He has served as the chapter director for the Genesee Valley chapter of the New York Civil Liberties Union and is currently the upstate representative for New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. He's a gun owner, a certified range safety officer, and former life member in the National Rifle Association. And Gary is also a volunteer member of the Friends and Foundation Book Sandwiched In and Tuesday Topics committees. Please join me in welcoming Peter and Gary to the podium.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I appreciate the invitation from Rebecca and from Gary to come back to Rochester. Make my home in Northern Virginia now, but Rochester and the greater Rochester area is definitely my hometown. So I'm very grateful to be here. And I want to thank the half of the room that's here that isn't related by blood or marriage. So thank you for coming. My parents are here, both my sisters are here, my brother-in-law, the fire marshal is here, my nephew, the paramedic, is here, and also old family friends like Mr. Gus White. So thank you all for coming. This is a serious topic, and so we'll treat it that way, but it's okay to enjoy the fact that we have old family and old friends together. I've put Mary's picture up here so to remind you of what motivates me and why I'm here. We'll talk. Is it on? Is it on? No. Just wait. Is it on now? Okay. So we'll talk. I want this to be more of an interactive conversation. I thought of whether I needed to have a PowerPoint, whether I needed to brief or a lecture, and I just didn't feel like that was appropriate. So we'll talk a little bit about my daughter Mary, her experience, what happened at Virginia Tech. We'll talk a little bit about the national, is that much better? Okay. About the national conversation, what I've experienced myself over the last few years of doing this work. And I will then turn it over to Gary, who will talk in some detail and with some PowerPoint slides about some state and local issues and some very concrete things that you can do here locally. I thought it was appropriate to start with one graphic. We recently, as I'm sure most of you know, lost a great American literary figure in Harper Lee. And since this is a library topic talk, I thought it was appropriate at the time between literature and this issue. And so this is not for me to compare myself to Atticus Finch, certainly not to Gregory Peck, but the point of the quote, I think, is apt. I feel like in our society and our culture today, there is sometimes confusion about what it means to be courageous, to be brave. Mao said power comes from the barrel of a gun. Well, I'm not a Maoist, and I don't suppose many of you are either. I think it can be misconstrued that courage comes from being armed. Courage, I think, actually comes from someplace inside us. Courage is what we see depicted here, doing the right thing even when you know it's going to be hard and you may not succeed, but you do the right thing anyway. Power comes from the conviction of doing right, even when it's not popular or it may be contested in a way that's very uncomfortable. So the people that I work with have that kind of courage, and they have that kind of power behind them. So that's the place I come from in doing this work. I wanted to thank, too, Evan Dawson of WXXI and Gary Craig of the Democrat and Chronicle for helping to introduce this talk. And perhaps some of you heard the segment on the radio or saw the piece in the paper today that introduced Mary and our experience somewhat. But I'll talk a little bit about our experience. Mary, who, as you can see, is a beautiful girl with a smile that lights up a room and is what's always remembered about her universally. It was like so many of our other young people. She graduated from Annandale High School in Northern Virginia, where we live. She was active in a whole lot of ways. And she was the president of her high school band. She played lacrosse. She was in Winter Color Guard, and she was taking International Baccalaureate courses, so a demanding course of study. But what made her unique in many ways is her ability to cross lines within a Northern Virginia high school culture that isn't always tolerant of line crossing and interacting with others. But what was important to her as a person was compassion and the other. And she was always looking for how she could make somebody's day happier, how she could make somebody feel better about themselves and what was going on in their life. So in that sense, she was very other-focused. When she went off to Virginia Tech, which is a very big school, she had a hard first semester, like a lot of students that go to big schools do. But in her second semester, she was coming to terms with that. She had found her own group of friends. She was headed towards a career in elementary education. And on the morning of April 16th, she was to have found out that she had been selected to be a Bible study leader with Campus Crusade, which was very important to her. Her faith was important to her, and we will never know if she got that news or not. But she had been home that weekend before. My parents, who are here with us today, had come to visit, and she wanted to spend some time with them, and she did. Mary was interested in baking and had decided she wanted to learn how to bake a pumpkin pie. And she had baked a pie that weekend. Was very proud of herself and had taken a slice of it back with her to her dorm room. And I put her on the bus at the metro station near our home and said goodbye to her, and that was the last time I ever saw her alive. She returned to the campus of Virginia Tech at some point ate the pie, because when we went to her dorm room later, we found the empty container there with the fork still in it. And she got up that morning and went to her French class in Norris Hall. Norris Hall on the campus of Virginia Tech was an engineering building. And so at that time, we had no reason to believe that a French class would be in an engineering building. We didn't know exactly what her schedule was. I wasn't even sure at that time what class she was in. As events unfolded there, and I'll just remind you briefly, many of you may remember this, but there were two separate shooting incidents at Virginia Tech on April 16th. Early in the morning, 2 people were shot and killed in one dormitory at Virginia Tech, and that was being investigated as the morning wore on and as Mary and others went to class. The people in her French class knew about that shooting, and they had talked about it. But what nobody knew, and of course nobody could predict, was that the shooter was coming back, and he was coming back to the campus and had a plan to target classes in Norris Hall. And he came back, executed his plan, and the students in the French class were doing their drills in French grammar and began hearing popping noises, which they associated with construction that was ongoing nearby. And it wasn't until their teacher went to the door and saw what was happening that they understood what was going on. And for a period of minutes that must have seemed like an eternity, the classrooms on that floor were targeted by the gunman. Mary's French class sustained the most casualties that day because he came back to her classroom the most times. So it was a French class, a German class, and graduate level engineering classes that were targeted. Mary was one of the youngest victims. The oldest victim was 76-year-old Professor Liviu Librescu, a Romanian who was a Holocaust survivor and was shot to death blocking the door so that his students could jump out the window to safety. And the whole event only ended when the gunman killed himself as the police were closing in to the building. So this was the single deadliest incident by a single gunman in American history, and one of the worst ever anywhere. I think that's probably how you all remember it, but it was, as all of these incidents are, an immense personal tragedy for everyone involved, for the individuals and for the families and for the communities, that school, that whole area of Virginia, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and of course it was a national tragedy because of the scope and scale of it. So I don't ask you to try to imagine that kind of a personal loss, because I don't believe anybody that hasn't experienced it can really fully comprehend what it means. But I can tell you a little bit of what it means over time. You don't move on from a loss like that, but you can move forward. I always explain it to people as there is a hole or a gap in your life and the lives of everybody that was associated with Mary or with your loved one that kind of goes forward in time. And you live around that emptiness. You live around that gap. And the edges start out very sharp and very jagged. They wear down over time and they become softer, but they never go away. And that emptiness never goes away. So we can't choose what happens to us in this life very often, but we can choose how we respond to it. And one of the ways that I and my family and others involved with Virginia Tech have chosen to respond to it is to deal with issues that were highlighted so dramatically by Mary's killing and the killing of 31 other people, which include mental health issues. They include campus safety and security issues. I'm very active on those issues. I'm not here to talk about those today per se, but it also includes gun violence, and that's inescapable. We have to address the reality and the facts that gun violence exists. It's a real thing, and it goes on and on and on in our country. I'll talk a little bit about numbers later, and Gary will go into some detail later. But I want to make sure you understand the intensely personal nature of gun violence in this country. It's not just numbers. It's not just statistics. It's not the aggregate of tens of thousands. It's every individual that's killed or injured, and then everyone that touches that individual. And the circles kind of ripple out, like when you throw a pebble into a pond. Those ripples go out, and they impact us at a local level, at a community level, at a state level, on a national level, even on a global level. So I'll be happy to talk in the question and answer about any more details that you would like to ask about that. I have had to talk about this a lot, and so I can do it. But I just want to emphasize at the outset that this is intensely personal for me and for anybody that experiences it, and it can happen to anyone, anywhere, at any time. Gun violence is no respecter of boundaries. It doesn't respect where you live or where you work or where you pray. It doesn't respect who you are. It doesn't respect any of the things that we use to kind of divide ourselves up and identify ourselves. It comes to individuals where they are, and there's nothing magic that shields any individual from it. So it's an intensely personal and individual tragedy every single time it happens. I'll talk a little bit, as I said, about some of the national numbers so you understand the scope and scale of it, what goes on every day in this country. And I'm indebted to the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence for having put together a very handy one-page summary because it collapses it all down to the very hard, cold facts that there are too many victims of gun violence, and as a nation we can do better, and we should do better. So in a year on average, there's over 108,000 people who were shot in murders, assaults, suicides, suicide attempts, unintentional shootings, or even by police intervention. 32,000 plus people die every year from gun violence, which includes a little over 11,000 murdered, almost 20,000 suicides by gun, and that's something I think Gary's going to address. And then hundreds more unintentionally, police intervention, a couple hundred. Every year we don't know what the intention was. We know they were killed by gun, but we don't know the intention. And of the people that survive, we're talking almost 76,000 who survive injuries. When you talk about children and teens, as we've seen graphically just in the last couple days, but we hear about these stories every week. Over 17,000 children and teens are shot in murders, assaults, suicides, suicide attempts. 2,600, almost 2,700 who die from gun violence. 14,000, almost 15,000 are injured. Every day we're talking almost 300 people getting shot in America, and 89 of those people die. 208 are shot and survive, and that's all ages. And when you talk about children and teens, it's 48 children and teens, ages 0 to 19, who were shot, and 7 of them die. 41 are shot and survive. So those numbers are numbing. At least to me they are, and I suspect to you they are as well. Staggering, really, when you think about this in terms of public health. Every day, the drumbeat that goes on. We have some members of the media here today, and I spoke with them, and no surprise to them, the way the media covers gun violence in this country is not blameless when it comes to desensitizing us as a culture and a society to the results, the intensely personal nature of the damage that's done, the killing and the wounding and the harming of the individual, and then those concentric circles I talked about. So media coverage, there's a part to play there. But there's a sense of learned helplessness that goes along with that. We learn, I think, sometimes a wrong lesson. We learn a lesson that I think isn't true, that there's nothing we can do, that it's just a fact of life and we have to live with it. Well, I heard something not long ago that stuck with me, and I can't remember whose quote it is, but I'll use it anyway. Even when we are largely powerless, we are not helpless. Just because we don't have power in a conventional sense doesn't mean that we can't do something, that we can't act. So my hope is today that through discussing experience and the facts of gun violence, that you'll feel that you're not helpless, that there are things that you can do, and Gary's going to address some of those things that you can do right here locally. But I'll talk a little bit about my own experience at the national level and in other states dealing with this issue. So we had expected, of course, in the wake of Virginia Tech, that there would be an impetus for change. We thought at the national level and we thought at the state level. And indeed, there was some impetus in Virginia. We fixed the problem that allowed the shooter in our case to purchase his handguns. His mental health records did not get into the instant background check system because Virginia had a very poor record at that time of submitting those mental health records. The governor fixed that by executive order, and that was shored up later by the General Assembly, and now Virginia is a national leader in submitting those kind of records to the background check system. And by the way, the latest numbers from Brady are since 1994 when the background check system was introduced, 2.6 million sales have been stopped by the background check system. So if anybody ever tells you the background checks don't work, they're wrong. The facts speak for themselves. Background checks do work, and they work best when they're applied to every sale and every transfer. Now, there may be some exceptions for transfers between family members and those kinds of things, but when we're talking about sales or transfers between parties unknown to each other, it's really important for all of us and for the people involved in the transaction that they cover themselves through the background check system. So I go to other states. A few years ago, I went up to Helena, Montana. I never thought I would go to Helena, Montana, let alone in the middle of the winter, but I went there and spoke to the Judiciary Committee of their legislature. Their legislature only meets once every 2 years. On the off year, they have their committee meetings. So I went and spoke to their committee and talked about the fact that in Montana, they had submitted, I think, 3 mental health records to the background check system, when by their population they should have submitted about 6,000. And you would have thought it would have been an easy sale to the Montana State Legislature to say you should probably catch up on that. Well, I spoke, and then a panel of 4 people from the ACLU, the National Association for the Mentally Ill, the Montana Shooting Sports Federation, and the American Legion lined up to present what I considered a series of red herring arguments about mental health, privacy, stigmatization, none of which really had anything to do. And the guy from the American Legion was mad at the Veterans Administration, which the state of Montana doesn't have anything to do with, but he got to talk, and so I had to get up afterwards and explain again, no, I'm not talking about stigmatizing the mentally ill. I'm not talking about infringing their privacy. I'm not talking about veterans not being able to go out on, hunting expeditions to recover from traumatic stress post-wartime. I'm not talking about any of those things. I'm talking about submitting records of people adjudicated mentally ill, already under federal law prohibited from purchasing a firearm, into a background check system, so that when the dealer goes to look and the record comes up, there's one letter that appears. One letter. It doesn't say anything about their condition. It doesn't say anything about how they've been treated. It just says this person is prohibited by law from purchasing a firearm. And end of sale. Doesn't happen. So these are the kinds of things that we've dealt with on a state level. I have been down to Austin, Texas, where I used to live for several years when I was stationed there in the Air Force. They decided that they would, in their assembly, legalize concealed carry on college campuses. They decided that would be a good idea, even though Admiral McRaven, who had retired from the Navy as the head of the Special Operations Command and was the chancellor of the University of Texas, himself a gun owner, by his own admission, avid Second Amendment advocate, said this is a bad idea. Don't do it. Well, they did it, and what's happened most recently is, as this law has come into fruition, is the dean of their School of Architecture has resigned and left the University of Texas at Austin because he's uninterested in armed confrontations with students in his classrooms, strangely enough. in a lot of cases, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and I don't want to leave you the impression that we are only fighting the good fight to see good bills go down. In other states like Oregon, like in Washington, we've seen universal background checks put up to a vote in their legislatures or by referendum that have been approved. Other states like Maine, it's gotten on the ballot by referendum. In Virginia, we've fought off some bad bills, and here most recently our governor made a deal, not all of us thought was the perfect deal, where the NRA got what they wanted on concealed carry reciprocity, which is a whole other discussion we could have. But in return, for the first time in Virginia, we got, in law, domestic violence abusers who are subject to a permanent protective order must sell or transfer their firearms within 24 hours of the issuance of the order. Now, that doesn't go nearly far enough because the danger period is often during the temporary protective order, but it's a start. It's a beginning of something. Voluntary background checks at Virginia gun shows. We have been pushing for a long time for mandatory background checks at gun shows, but part of the deal the governor brokered was to resource the state police to do voluntary background checks at gun shows. Again, not enough, but a start. So we make, in the words of one of my old bosses, little steps for little feet. Advances on some of these things, and Gary will talk about that here in what's going on here in New York as well. But I mention these things to point out that there's movement at the state level, there's movement at local levels. At the national level in Congress, I sat in the Senate chamber in 2013 when we hoped the Manchin-Toomey bill, which was a compromise bill on universal background checks, would be brought up for a vote. It never got to a vote on the floor of the Senate because the supporters were unable to break the filibuster that the opponents had mounted. We couldn't get to 60 votes to get it to the floor for a vote. So two of the great ladies of the movement that I'm involved with stood up and yelled shame and got detained by the Capitol Police. I could not do that because I didn't want to put my employment at risk, but they bravely did that. And those bills, in the wake of the community college shooting in Oregon, got brought back up again in the Senate and still couldn't get a vote. So at the national level, I believe that the tide is turning, but I think it's a long, slow struggle. And I think it's going to take a long time for Congress to get their arms around what they need to do. And we can talk about what needs to happen for that change. But in the meantime, there are things that executives can do. And I had the privilege of standing with the President and the Vice President at the White House in January, and then to be at the town hall the President hosted on CNN on this issue. And the President instituted some executive actions to try to strengthen the role of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. By the way, New York State is the target of a lot of gun trafficking, if you're not aware of that. And I'm sorry to say that Virginia got back in the business of supporting gun trafficking to New York when our governor allowed the repeal of the one handgun a month restriction on purchases there in Virginia. So unfortunately, the iron pipeline on I-95 is open again. And so you see crime guns turning up in New York State that originate from places like Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina. And here in Rochester, I know that there have been some high-profile prosecutions recently by the U.S. Attorney on gun trafficking issues. But those are the kinds of issues that we have to address at a national level with executive action, and when the Congress gets convinced of the need to move, then through legislation as well. And I think that might be a good place for me to break and turn it over to Gary, who is going to talk about some local issues, and we'll have time for questions and answers, I think, when Gary's done. Thanks, Dave. Sure.
Well, first I want to thank everybody for coming out today. This is a great response, and it's a very timely topic. I met Peter a week ago on the telephone. Originally, this was scheduled that I was going to speak for my organization here, and then Rebecca, the program director, asked, "Do you mind if Peter came?" And I was just so glad to hear that we could have somebody come and tell this story. The way I got involved with this is again, I spent 30 years in law enforcement. And so I have a little bit of a different perspective than Peter. We have many things in common. Peter had a military career, I had a paramilitary career. He is the victim of gun violence. Part of my job, and do forgive me, part of my job when I was a police commander was I was the guy that knocked on the door to let Peter know that his daughter was never coming home. Right? So when we have these debates and discussions, and you'll hear people talk about their Second Amendment rights and the slippery slope to whatever, tyranny, all right, we can never lose sight of the fact that when we talk about these numbers, we're talking about people. We're talking about people's mothers, their brothers, their fathers, their sisters. It never goes away. I do a lot of lobbying for our organization. I'm going to talk a little bit about that organization. I was in Albany, and a legislator says to me, but you know, only about 600 people a year die in mass shootings. It's a very small number. Yeah, how do you answer that? Come and ride with me when I knock on the door in the middle of the night. Come and talk to Peter. All right. So that's kind of, I don't want to go, we want to make sure we get the questions answered, but just to let you know that this is how things happen. Unfortunately sometimes, sadly sometimes, is when people are personally involved and they understand what's behind these numbers. As Peter says, there's a certain numbness to what goes on. We all heard last week what happened in Kalamazoo, correct? Everybody hear about that? The 14 people who were shot? All right. 2 days later, who heard what happened in Washington State? Anybody? Right. 5 people killed in a single shooting. Who heard what happened in Burton County, Ohio yesterday? Good. Yeah. All right. A 14-year-old walks into a school cafeteria and shoots 4 of his classmates. Sad to say, and I'm going to tell you this, I work, as Rebecca said, on this committee, and I work with this audience, and I know that this is a really well-educated, and what I mean by well-educated, not necessarily in a degree, but people that keep up with current events and understand things and the nuances. And the idea that, you know, we don't even hear these things. And yet in other countries and other nations, if you had a shooting that involved, you know, 5 people being shot at one time, or a 14-year-old bringing a gun into school and shooting 4 of his classmates, that, you know what, it doesn't even make the front page, it doesn't even make, you know, the hard news. You have to look around and dig for these things. That says something about where we're at too. So that's how I got involved. That's kind of why it means something to me. The way I got involved with New Yorkers Against Gun Violence, and I'm going to try to get this PowerPoint working, if you'll forgive me. I think this is the right ticket. Nope. Here we go. Here we go. And I'm sorry if I left the outline on these things. So a couple of years ago, the New York passes the New York SAFE Act. And I'm going to talk very, very quickly about the SAFE Act. The New York State SAFE Act is very much like affordable care, right? The Affordable Care Act. When we talk to people, everybody hates Obamacare, but if you start asking people, what is it that you like about the Affordable Care Act, they all like that stuff. So when we start talking about the SAFE Act, a small number of people told us the SAFE Act's really bad, it's going to take away our liberties, it's going to take away our freedoms. But then when you ask questions like, well, who here thinks that somebody should be able to buy a gun and not undergo a background check? All right. So that's the SAFE Act. Who here thinks, you know, that people should have military-style weapons, you know, with no background check? Oh, forgive me. They could be purchased out of the back of a trunk of a car. Nobody thinks that. But when you start talking about the SAFE Act, right, people are against it. So when the SAFE Act gets passed, I'm excited. I'm thinking, this is good. It's about time. And then we started hearing things like all this, well, we got to repeal this. We got to repeal these things. So I wanted to get involved because of my past experiences in gun violence prevention, gun control, gun regulation, whatever we really choose to call it. And what I learned is, and I think a lot of us, what we know is this. The idea that we're going to get federal legislation passed is probably pretty slim. You know, Peter talked about these things. If people aren't aware, there's a series of amendments in Congress called the Terhart Amendments, right, which forbid the ATF, the one organization that deals with this issue, from releasing any data, even to local police departments, to government officials, to the public. Right? There's no other industry has the power to pass that kind of stuff. One of the interesting things about the ATF is this: is after 9/11 and the war on terrorism began, every police agency, every law enforcement organization in this country was beefed up, except for one. It was the ATF. The National Rifle Association has been very successful in reducing the number of ATF agents and the money that they get to spend on law enforcement. Now, when you look at things like San Bernardino, you have to ask yourself, when you look at the weapons were used, you know, these are the kinds of acts of terrorism we're dealing with. Why would you reduce the very funding to the organization that's going to be primary in controlling and enforcing that? It's because it's profits. Right? It's the profits of the gun industry. There's a series of amendments called the Dickey Amendments, which came up last year. Jay Dickey, who was a congressman or senator from Arkansas, passed a series of amendments that the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, cannot study gun violence. All right, what other public health issue do we have in this country that we've had the Congress say, you know what, we're forbidding the CDC from studying the problem? All right, that's the power of the NRA. That's the power of organizations like SCOPE, all right, which is a New York State gun rights organization. So in my frustration, but feeling that, like, well, what are we going to do at the federal level? Probably we're not going to be able to get a lot done. But one of the advantages of a federalist system is we can do stuff at the state level. So I wanted to get involved, and I got involved with New Yorkers Against Gun Violence as a state organization. As a state organization, we're able to pass things. One of the hopes we have, and as you heard in my bio, I at one time worked for the New York Civil Liberties Union. I worked very hard on the equal marriage debate. Remember that? Remember 10 years ago, people of the same sex couldn't get married, and now the question is today is like, what happened? Nobody cares. I mean, it's just like a given. Right? Quite frankly, what we hope to do is the same type of thing. There's going to be a critical mass at some point in time when people are just going to say this is enough. Right? We've had enough. Things have got to change. We are out of step with the rest of the world. Right? When we reach that critical mass, but we need examples. We need examples like New York State, we need examples like California, we need some other places that can pass things like the SAFE Act. And people realize, well, wait a second, we can have gun control, we can have gun regulations. It doesn't violate people's constitutional rights, and it works. And that's one of the things I'm going to show here. All right, Leah Gunn Barrett, by the way, is our executive director. Talk about personal, you know, how people get involved with this. Leah Gunn Barrett had a brother, she's from Kansas, not a liberal state. Her brother had a business in Oklahoma, not known as a liberal state. He was shot and killed in a robbery. All right, since then, she's dedicated herself to trying to get better gun regulations here in the United States. So it was founded in 1993 by some women in New York City who were at the point where a friend of theirs was murdered. And they decided to form this organization. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization to try to improve our situation here. In 1995, we formed the New Yorkers Against Gun Violence, formed an education fund. They go throughout schools in New York City and teach kids about good gun safety. It's the only statewide organization working to reduce gun violence through advocacy and education. I can tell you this, there's probably about 25 or 30 states now that have organizations like this. 10 years ago, I think New Yorkers and a couple other states were the only ones. What Peter talked about, so I'll just touch on this real quickly. This is from 2014. Almost 34,000 people died from guns. 84,000 non-fatal injuries at a cost of $229 billion a year. $229 billion a year. Where a lot of that cost comes from, police investigations, court costs, lost time, productivity. And don't think of everything as being crime and guns with crime violence. Actually, guns involved in, Yet gun violence involving or related to crime is only about 1/3 of the loss. 2/3 of these deaths are going to be from suicides. All right? The U.S. gun murder rate is 20 times higher for all individuals and 43 times higher for the 15 to 24-year-olds than any other industrialized country. This is the second one is sad. I really want people to think about this. Guns are the second leading cause of death amongst our youth, and the leading cause of death amongst black youth. All right? Pay attention to that. All right? Because it's not just black youth. So for anybody sitting back thinking like, you know what, we got to do something about this black on black crime, well, I'm telling you, all the white people from the suburbs, you're losing kids too. It's the second leading cause of death amongst all young people. Children and guns. In 2014, nearly 18,000 children and teens were injured by guns in the U.S. 2,500 were killed. 2011, 389 in New York. Why don't we hear about these things? And so you want to hear about these things? Read the obituaries. Look for a young face, and then look for the words unexpectedly or suddenly. For good reason, the media doesn't say anything about this. I'm going to tell you from my personal experience as a police officer, there were weeks that I was going to a teen suicide every day of the week. All right, every day of the week. Where did that 14-year-old get that gun to go into that school the other day? It's from people leaving guns just lying around the house. In 2014, almost 50 children in New York and teens died from gun violence. Suicide is the leading cause of death for kids aged 15 to 19, and guns are the most common method used. A gun in the home increases suicide risk by 17 times. More than 75% of the guns used in the suicides and unintentional injuries were stored in the home of the victim or a friend. That's a picture of a kid named Nicholas Numpkin. He was from Saratoga Springs. This is how he died. A friend of his found his dad's a 9mm pistol, and they were playing with it. All right, Nicholas ends up dead. All right, this is the kind of things we're talking about, the suicides and the accidental shootings. And these are all preventable. And keep in mind, firearms have an 85% fatality rate. Other means only have a 5% fatality rate. Here's just an interesting aside. The gun industry understands there's a limited market. They're selling more guns every year to fewer number of people. Well, if you're an industry, what do you have to do? You have to open up your market, right? So what they've been doing is, and I invite anybody, go to Wegmans and buy the gun magazines. You're going to see more and more pictures of women buying guns. There's a big push by the gun industry to sell pink guns, guns to women, all right? Here's an interesting fact. In New York State last year, all right, suicides amongst women was up proportionally with the number of guns that women bought. In the past, women commit suicide by taking pills, which usually isn't very effective. A gun is almost 100% effective. So women would take pills, and usually that didn't actually work. And the thing is when most people attempt to commit suicide, the vast majority of the time, once they get help, they don't do it again. 82% of the firearm suicides among youth under 18 use a gun belonging to a family member, usually a parent. A gun in the home doubles the risk of homicide, triples the risk of suicide, and increases by 12 the risk of family altercations leading to murder. Here's something interesting about gun sales too. Will a gun make you feel safer? Maybe it will. Maybe having a gun in a house will make you feel safer. Will it make you safer? No. If you want to buy a gun and have it in your house, I'm a gun owner, please do that. But if you're buying a gun because you think that it's making you safer, that's a feeling and an emotion. It's not what happens. Of the 37 school shootings in 26 states, the shooter got the gun from home or that of a friend or a relative more than 68% of the time. Columbine was an anomaly where those kids went out and bought guns. Usually school shootings are the gun used is dad's gun. Here's something interesting in New York. There's no requirement to store guns safely in the homes of children. This is a loophole in the SAFE Act. In the SAFE Act, if you live with somebody who's a felon or has a mental disease, you have to keep your guns locked up. Not if you have kids. There's no requirement. Now, I would like to think, and I hear this argument as I lobby in Albany all the time, Well, law-abiding and responsible gun owners keep their guns locked up. Really? Then where do these numbers come from? They're not just the irresponsible, non-law-abiding. I'm going to agree they're law-abiding and generally responsible people, but they're not thinking. All right? So one of the things that we're trying to do is, I'll go back to this for a second. One of the things that we're trying to do when we talk about, and I got the legislative priorities, is we're trying to get safe storage acts passed all throughout New York State. Okay? One of the things, because we've been told that people don't want safe storage, that apparently the status quo is acceptable. So we have now, in the last year, New Yorkers Against Gun Violence has worked hard to pass laws in the city of Albany. Saratoga Springs will be passing a law in the next few weeks, as will the city of Syracuse. Rochester has one now, Buffalo, and I'm happy that our organization is working with the Monroe County Legislature to try to propose and have that law passed in Monroe County. If you have a kid in the house, you got to keep your gun locked up. All right? That is being proposed by a good friend of mine, Ernest Flagler Mitchell, from the Monroe County Legislature. Here's a question that comes up, all right? And I'm going to skip these, and I'm going to go to something else, because it shows it a little better. People will often hear, well, you know, gun laws don't really work, right? We'll hear from people like, we don't need laws. Well, I don't know. I worked in law enforcement for a long time, and some of you people here are from my generation and maybe beyond. All right? Remember when we thought that everybody would wear their seatbelt because it was a smart thing to do? And nobody did. All right? When we talk about the law, and I work with the law my entire career, my entire career, one of the things we have to understand, beyond punishment of wrongdoers, etc., part of the law is to educate and set societal standards. All right? One of the standards we're trying to set is this. It is not okay to leave guns unlocked. It's not okay to leave guns unlocked around your house when you have kids in the house. Background checks work, registration works, right? All these things work, and we consistently hear, well, gun laws really don't work, it doesn't change it. The SAFE Act didn't work. Let me tell you, there have been over 6,000 arrests in New York State for violations of the SAFE Act. That's 6,000 illegal guns that were taken off the street due to the SAFE Act. And when we adjust for population, that spreads throughout the state. One of the things we always kept hearing is people upstate are different from people downstate. This is a downstate thing. Only people in New York City want this. All right? There was a survey that showed that's not the difference. All right? When you start breaking down the demographics, it's not necessarily upstate versus downstate. You know what it is? Anybody want to guess? It's men and women. And then by age. No matter where you survey women in this state, over 90% support strong gun laws. I'm sorry, guys, it's us. We are the problem. Interesting enough, guys like me are at one of the highest risks for gun suicides. Right? It's white males, older white males. Be that as it may. I want you to take a look at this. I know it's a little difficult to see, but what this is these are the states that have the stronger gun laws along this axis. These are the states that have the weaker gun laws. All right? You see where the weak gun laws? The Wyoming, the Louisianas, Alabama. Look where New York is, right? Stronger gun laws. The blue states, the red states. All right? I'm not a scientist, but we all know there's a difference between cause, coincidence, and correlation. I can't sit up here and say this is a cause, all right? But I'm telling you right now, this is not a coincidence. It's correlation. We know this is true. All right, I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so I'm going to end up real quick about some of the things we can do, what we're working on, and then we'll take some questions. So these are our legislative priorities. We have a state law, Nicholas's Law, which we want to pass to make the statewide safe storage. All right, again, that passed the Assembly. It hasn't passed the Senate. We are hearing people don't want this. We don't believe it. All right, this is part of what we are doing, part of our strategy. And again, thanks to Ernest and others, local legislators are passing these kind of things, and it shows people we want this. And it doesn't violate anybody's rights. These have been gone through federal courts, through state courts. They're fully consistent with the Constitution. All it's saying is if you got a gun in the house, you got to keep it locked up if there's a kid in the house. I mentioned Ernest. Here's something I want to touch on, and then I'm going to let it go. There's other things here, and I can hand these sheets out. Here's something that's really interesting. The Domestic Violence Firearms Surrender Law. I'm going to tell a quick story about my last lobby trip up to Albany. In New York State, if you get arrested for DWI, you lose your right to have a gun. You have a gun. Right? If you violate certain drug laws, you can't have a gun. We know this, right? It's as our conservative friends say, it's holding people personally accountable. Here's something interesting. You can be arrested or convicted of a misdemeanor level domestic violence. All right? You get your guns back. So I'm sitting in this legislator's office one day, and this is about 2 weeks ago, and we're talking about this proposal, and he's from the southern tier, and he says, well, let me ask you a question, Gary. He says, would you be willing to do this? Like, so somebody gets arrested for a case of domestic violence, and he loses his guns. Like, maybe after 5 years, could he get them back? And I said, yeah, well, you know what? I'll think about that. And I did. I started thinking, what are you thinking? Right? So what you're saying is, if somebody gets arrested for drunk driving, or they get arrested for certain drug crimes, misdemeanor drug crimes, they can never have a gun again. But are you telling me that if you slap a woman around just a little bit, you get your guns back? Is that the argument we're having? No. I mean, it is, yes. But people need to think about this. We need to get this passed. I'm telling you as a man, right? If a man hits a woman, he loses his right to ever have a gun again. All right? He should know that when he lifts his hand to slap that woman. All right? I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. So, we want to, I'm sorry, I've gone over my time. We do want to take some questions. So if somebody has a question, please.
Yes, this is
Peter.
Regarding the Nicholas Law and the domestic law. And I'm wondering if that could be a proposition on a ballot.
You know, I don't know. I don't know that. Like, you mean like a proposition? I think most propositions are budgetary.
That's too bad.
It is too bad. So what do you do about it, though? You find out who your state assemblyman is, and you know what? You got to call. Like around here, we're talking about, and for your Senate, you're talking about guys like Robach and Funky and maybe Bill Nojay, right? It's a tough sell with some of these guys, but you need to call them and tell them, like, I don't understand this. Why are we treating women differently when it comes to violent crimes? Yes, go ahead.
I was wondering what your source is for some of these statistics and numbers you're quoting. The CDC's report on gun violence authorized by President Obama that came out a while ago is way different. And the FBI over the last 12 years shows that gun violence is down year over year. But you're quoting these huge numbers, and I'm just wondering where you're getting those numbers from.
Sure, and that's a good point, because what people will do is one of them's from the Gun Violence Policy Center, and one of them's from, like, Wired Magazine just did. They're independent sources. The Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. I'm going to, like, take Johns Hopkins School of Medicine as a reliable source over, like, the National Rifle Association on these things. So where this works is the devil's in the details. So when you look at some years, you'll see that violence is down. One's how we measure violence, and over what time period do we want to measure it. If you measure it year to year, you're going to find, like, maybe between 2012 and 2013, it's down. But you have to look at graphs, you have to look at data for 10, 15, 20 years back. It's not even close. Let me, just real quick. So 2 days ago, an international organization came out with statistics on some of the most dangerous places to live because of gun violence. We're like the 13th most dangerous place to live in the world. And we're behind places like Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico. All right, that's the crowd we're in. The rate for the United States for gun deaths is 10.5, I believe, for every 100,000. We are this close behind the next highest one is Burundi at 10.9. Burundi is an African country mired in a civil war. That if you want to go to Burundi, the State Department will send you a warning and say, you shouldn't travel there, it's too dangerous. That's who we associate with up there. Canada, all right, which has just as many freedoms as we do. I don't know. I spent a lot of time in Canada. I don't find anybody in Canada that's oppressed. All right, they're like at 2, and we're in the 10s.
I'm not sure what the point of the question is. If the suggestion is that these gun deaths and injuries aren't happening, I categorically reject that statement or that suggestion. If the question is, what's the correlation of gun deaths to reductions in violent crime, that's an interesting discussion that we could have with criminologists, people like Daniel Webster at Johns Hopkins who have done excellent work on it. But the fact of these deaths and injuries are indisputable. That there is no question that these are happening and in the numbers that we're talking about. So that's really all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I think we did. So even if you wanted to show us numbers that showed us, let's say it's half. Is that acceptable? Well, let's say it's so far off that only 20,000 people a year are dying from gun violence. Let us say that only, I don't know, maybe another 20 are kids killing themselves with guns. Is that acceptable? Is that where we want to be at? Yes, please.
My limited understanding and memory is that Michael Bloomberg threw a lot of money in a successful effort to get laws passed in Washington or Oregon to prevent gun violence. Is that the solution? Do we need billions of dollars? How was he successful, if I'm correct in that?
If you're talking about universal background checks in Oregon and Washington, I think you're talking about Mayor Bloomberg's group Every Town for Gun Safety. Is that correct? Okay, so the mayor is well known as an advocate for common sense gun solutions. That organization is well known. Its support of those measures is a matter of public record. There's nothing hidden about it. There's nothing underhanded about it. And those things won on their own merits. In fact, in Washington State, there was a competing measure put up against it funded by other people with other intentions to confuse the voters, and the voters saw through it. So if the implication is that there's something underhanded about supporting legislation in the states that supports gun violence prevention, I don't accept that premise.
Let me clarify. I'm looking for a positive example of how to get these laws passed.
Well, I think you saw one. When the laws are brought to the public as opposed to state legislatures that are behind the times, they get approved. When state legislatures take account of the broad popular support among their constituents for those laws, then they start to move. But when you're dealing with legislatures like mine in Virginia, which are a little bit behind in their understanding of where their constituents are, it takes more time and effort and persistence. So part of the answer is persistence, but sometimes it does take raising awareness, and sometimes that takes money.
Last comment, sorry. Sandy Hook and other major tragedies, well known, brought out funding and organizations and so forth, and I've made contributions, and the frustration, sorry, it's not at your level of it, is that it doesn't seem to have much effect. Does it take a walk to the state capitals or the national capital or something else to have an effect?
Yeah, so part of the question is, and you can almost adapt this to anything, right, is how do we change the laws? We have to let legislators know what we want, one way or the other. And I don't care whatever the issue is. You have to let them know, all right? And so one of the things I'm asking you and the audience participation in this is, and again, we know democracy is not a spectator sport. And unfortunately, for better or worse, in Citizens United, the people that seem to have the biggest money have the best voices. That said, all right, there are times, like when we passed the SAFE Act, then when people sit back and say they've had enough and they call their legislators and they let them know, this I support. All right? These organizations, one of the things that money gives these organizations, they're able to make campaign contributions, right? There's that. But they're also able to do things like get their people to call. They do robocalls. Make sure you call your legislator. You know, make whether it's, you know, make sure you call Ernest. Ernest needs to know that you support him. The Republic, quite frankly, and this, we're nonpartisan, but this is the deal. Ernest is a Democrat, and he's going to be introducing this. The Republicans have to know that folks want that when a law that makes as much common sense that if you have a gun in the house and there's a kid in the house, you should lock your gun up. So I'm going to ask people here, find out what district you live in the county, or just call the Monroe County Legislature. You can like just Google Monroe County Legislature. Call there and say, listen, I want you to support this bill. All right? When you talk to your friends and neighbors, look at, do you understand what we're talking about here? There was, in the New York State Senate this year, there was a bill that was proposed by Senator Funke that would loosen up universal background, well, I'm not going to call it universal, it would loosen up background checks in New York State. Who here believes that we have universal background checks in New York? No, we don't. We do not have universal background checks. All right? If you have a firearm and you want to give it to your kid, you can with no background check. All right? Who can then give it to another family member? Who can then give it to another family member? Well, what's happened to that firearm? All right? Adam Lanza's got his gun from his mom because she thought it was going to be, he could handle that. All right? Chris Kyle handed a weapon to a guy because he thought he could handle it. We don't always know what goes on in our kids' head. I'm going to guess again with some of this audience. We've had kids, right? We've had teenagers. All right, I'm going to tell a story, and I hope I can get through it. When I was a young policeman, I was a technician. I became a technician. Technicians are the guys that go and take fingerprints and photographs and whatever, right? NCIS or whatever. You know, it's very popular. It's my first tech job. I get a call for go to a tech job. I'm all excited. I show up. Mom and Dad had gone out for an anniversary dinner. What they didn't know is their 18-year-old son had a bad day. What they found was him sitting on the couch, dead. He had taken his dad's gun, which he kept in a drawer by his bed for a home invasion purposes or self-protection, and shot himself. Now, do you think for a second that those parents knew what was going on in their kid's head? That if they had known that they would have left that house? I'm going to say no. None of these kids that are committing suicides, none of them know. So, but on the other hand, you want to logically tell me